Welcome to an introduction to accounting brought to you by Parkbench Tutors. You can find us at parkbenchtutors.com or you can look us up on Facebook, Parkbench Tutors. In this podcast we are going to look at the treatment of work in progress from the point of view of costing. Remember, work in progress means material that is not complete at the end of a period. So at the start of a period there will often be opening work in progress, and at the end of the period there will be closing work in progress. And of course during the period there will have been work that has been completed. So how do we define work in progress? Well, we can look at it in terms of material, we can look at it in terms of labour. In other words, how much of the material is complete or how much is complete in terms of the labour that needs doing for the task. And we may take one or the other or both. So the simplest way of determining costs is to work out a basis of equivalent units to give us completed total units. So for example, if we have 400 units that are complete, that's 400 equivalent units. So an equivalent unit is basically a unit that's complete. If you get 400 units that are 50% complete, then if you multiply 400 by 50%, you get 200 equivalent units. So we then say that for costing purposes we add those two together, so the total equivalent units for costing will be 400 plus 200, which is 600. Okay, let's consider a few examples here. Troglodyte clothing. At the end of the first period you get 5,000 completed units and 2,500 units considered as 50% complete, and the costs for that period are 18,750. Okay, first of all we need the number of units. We know we've got 5,000 equivalent units. If we've got 2,500 units that are 50% complete, that's another 1,250 equivalent units. I've multiplied 2,500 by 50%. So my total of equivalent units is 6,250 and my costs for the period are 18,750. So if I divide the cost by the number of equivalent units, I get £3. So that's the cost per equivalent unit is £3. So the cost of my finished production is 3 times 5,000, because I have 5,000 finished units, that's 15,000. And the cost of my work in progress is 3 times the 1,250 equivalent units, which is 3,750. And of course those will both add up to the total cost for the period. Now let's consider another example. Astro Products, producing high insulation materials. At the end of their period they've got 20,000 materials cost, 16,000 labour, total cost 36, and completed articles 6,400 articles whose completion is estimated as materials 50% complete, labour 25% complete. So we're now dealing with this in terms of materials and in terms of labour. So first of all we'll determine the equivalent units for the work in progress. We have 6,000 completed, 4,000 work in progress. So the 4,000 work in progress is 50% complete, so the equivalent units for the work in progress are 50% of 4,000, that's 2,000. In the case of the labour, the 4,000 which are work in progress are only 25% complete, so that's 25% of 4,000 gives us a 1,000 equivalent for work in progress. So my total equivalent units are 8,000 for materials and 7,000 for labour. I now need to determine the average cost per equivalent unit. I have 8,000 equivalent units with 20,000 costs for material and 7,000 equivalent units for 16,000 costs for labour, which works out at £2.50 a unit for materials and £2.29 per unit for labour. Now I need to apportion the costs for the finished units and for the work in progress. So we have materials 6,000 equivalent units that are completed and 2,000 for the work in progress. So multiply by 2.5, the 2.5 times 6,000 is 15,000. That's my costs for my completed work on materials, and similarly 2.29 times 6,000 13,700. I'm doing a bit of rounding here. That gives me a cost for the completed units in terms of labour. Total cost for the completed units 28,700. I now do the same thing for the work in progress. I had 2,000 of those equivalent units. 2,000 times 2.5 is 5,000. If I do the same for labour and I round it, it comes to about 2,300, so that's 7,300 total. And if I add those up, my total cost 20,000 for materials, 16,000 for labour, total of 36,000, which is what we had to begin with. So, what happens when there's opening work in progress? Well, that depends on how you're valuing the inventory. So it could be done by FIFO, or it could be done by a weighted average. I'm ignoring LIFO here. I know it's still in use in the USA, but this is for a UK program. So we'll have lopsided garments. I've bought a number of those recently. Lopsided garments have opening work in progress 12,000 units, considered as being 50% complete on material, 75% complete for labour, and the closing work in progress 4,000 units, 40% complete for materials, 50% complete for labour, and we've got 25,000 units that were completed during the period. So I look at the costs of what I've got. We have 5,000 for opening work in progress, 48,000 costs during the period, 3,000 for the labour, 3,000. So I've got 8,000 for work in progress and 108,000 for costs during the period. So where's my starting point? Well, I look at the flow of the units. So the opening work in progress plus the units that get started must be equal to the number of units completed plus the end work in progress. So basically 12,000 plus however many we've started gives 25,000 plus 4,000. So in other words, I have started 17,000 units. I have therefore got, if I look for that balance, started and finished in the period will be 5,000. So let's look at the equivalent units for work in progress. On the FIFO method, we have 12,000 units, 50% complete, and that gives an equivalent of 6,000 units. This is for opening work in progress for materials. Similar thing for labour, 12,000 units, 25% complete gives 3,000 equivalent units. Add the work started and completed and add the equivalent units. So started and completed was 5,000 for materials, 5,000 for labour. And so at the closing I've got 4,000 units, which are 40%. I'm looking at the materials at the moment. 4,000 units at 40% complete, which is a 1,600, which will give me a total of equivalent units of 12,600. And total equivalent units for labour will then also be, let me find where I've got this, 3,000, that will be 10,000. So the costs in the period for materials 3.81 per unit, and for labour £6 per unit. So all completed units must be the started and completed in that period plus the opening work in progress. So the completed units for the materials will be 11,000. The completed units for labour will be 8,000. So now let's take the cost of the completed units and the closing work in progress. We've got the cost of the completed units 41,905 for materials, 6,095 for the closing work in progress. And similarly for labour 48,000 the cost of the completed ones, 12,000 for the cost of the work in progress, giving us a total of 89,905 for the completed units, 18,095 for the closing units. So we add the cost of the opening work in progress that is now being completed, which was the 8,000, and that gives us for a cost of the completed units 97,905. If you use the weighted average cost period, then what we do is take the cost of the opening work in progress and the costs during the period, we add those together, and then we distribute them over all the work completed plus the closing work in progress. In other words, completed units and closing work in progress are valued at the same cost per unit. So costs are distributed at the average cost. So all costs, 48,000 plus 5,000 for materials, 60,000 plus 3,000 for labour, gives 116,000. So all the units completed are, for cost in period on the weighted 116,000 for the costs in the period, for materials 63,000 for labour. Right, the units processed 25,000 for materials, 25,000 for labour. The equivalent units now for the closing work in progress we need to work out. So we've got 4,000 which are 40%, gives 1,600, 4,000 that are 50%, is for the labour, 2,000. I've now got my total units, which will be 26,600 equivalent units for materials. That's the 25,000 plus the 1,600. And 27,000 total units for the labour, which will be from the 25,000 plus the 2,000 equivalent. So the costs per unit are 26,600 gives, divided by the costs in the period, by cost in period, 53,000 by 26,600 is roughly £1.99 per unit, and for labour, divide 63,000 by 27,000 is £2.33 per unit. So the cost of my completed units for materials 49,812, and the cost of my labour 58,333. I've got that obviously by multiplying the units processed at 25,000 by 199 for materials and 25,000 by 233 to give the 58,333 for labour. In the same way, I have an equivalent 1,600 for materials multiplied by 1.99 gives me a closing work in progress cost of 3,188. I do the same thing for labour. I multiply my equivalent units by 2.33, and so 2,000 times 2.33 is 4,667. If I want to check my calculations, I had costs in period which totaled 116,000, so at the end my completed units and my cost for the closing work in progress 108,145 plus 7,855 is going to give me 116,000. That ends our podcast relating to work in progress, narrated by David Hopcroft and brought to you by Parkbench Tutors. If you want access to all our podcasts in the form of a playlist, then we have a Moodle setup which will give you access to free courses if you want to sign up, and you sign up at parkbenchtutors.com. Thank you for watching and for listening. We wish you success in your studies.